going to share the scripture with you taken from the Gospel according to St. John, chapter 18. And I'm going to be reading verses 1 to 12. John 18, 1 to 12. When Jesus had finished praying, he left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side, there was an olive grove, and he and his disciples went into it. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met with his disciples there. So Judas came to the grove, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." "I told you I am he," Jesus said. "If you're looking for me, then let these men go." This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" This is the word of the Lord. But it seems you can find them pretty much everywhere you go these days. In the mall, on the jogging trail, maybe even in the pew right beside you. There's a great deal of diversity in both the appearance and the nature of their scars. Some have been caused by physical trauma, others by mental, emotional, even spiritual wounds. It's difficult to imagine, perhaps, but some have even been wounded at church. Sometimes their wounds are, as Albert Osborne said, from all but God far hidden. Hidden or exposed, they're painful just the same. They're the walking wounded. And if our eyes are opened, we can see them all around us every day of our lives. I can't tell you a great deal about Malchus. I know he was a servant of the high priest. I know he was in the Garden of Gethsemane that night when Jesus was arrested, and that he was simply doing his job on that fateful night. I can tell you something else about him, though. He was within reach of two very different things: Peter's sword and the touch of the Master's hand. Malchus is a reminder of the many people who routinely do their duty from day to day. He was caught up in an evil, scheming plot, but it wasn't his plot. He wasn't the author of this. He was simply doing his duty. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he suddenly became the victim of Peter's anger and frustration. Peter couldn't swing at the real enemy, those who had plotted and schemed and made this night happen. They were nowhere to be found. But Malchus was there, and he was very visible. John 18:10 says, "Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his ear." The servant's name was Malchus. Malchus and Peter were in the very same garden, but in terms of their worldview, they may as well have been on separate planets. To Malchus, Jesus and his followers were a dangerous, deluded group, and he and his fellow soldiers were under orders from the high priest, whom they were convinced was doing the best thing that was in the best interest of the nation. Malchus was convinced that what he was doing was legal, it was right, it was necessary. So much so that even after Jesus had put his ear back on and healed it, he still continued to arrest him. From Peter's perspective, Malchus and his entourage were public enemy number one. They came to capture his friend, his future, and ultimately what he saw as God's plan to redeem the world. Jesus was, of course, what all Jews had been waiting and watching for. He was the long-expected, promised Messiah. But the Jews didn't understand that. Peter thought he did, but his well-intentioned action actually placed Jesus at greater risk. Now he could easily be accused of being the leader of a group of violent revolutionaries who were bent and determined on destroying and overthrowing Rome. And so Jesus has to move very quickly to control the damage, to reprimand Peter, restore order instead of the chaos that he had created. Jesus would be crucified, but there must be not even the slightest hint, no possible justification to any claim that said that he was being killed because of his own crimes. John summarized that when he quotes Jesus in chapter 18, verse 36, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews, but now my kingdom is from another place." When we visited the beautiful Garden of Gethsemane back in 1997, it was very difficult to imagine it as a possible battleground, but it became one on this night. We know what battlegrounds are like, don't we? Our wounds may not be physical in nature, but which one of us hasn't suffered internal bleeding from mental anguish caused by someone else? Someone who just doesn't understand what we're going through, and yet are relentless in their criticism or in their rejection. And then, of course, there's the trauma of trying to reconcile our pain and our suffering with a God who is supposed to be just, who is supposed to be good. And so there's that internal trauma, and then there's that trauma that's caused from external circumstances. Malchus posed a threat to Peter and to what Peter held dear in life. And so outpowered and outnumbered, with no place to run, Peter was determined to protect his Messiah, to protect his way of life, his worldview, if you like, even if that worldview was rather ill-informed. The whole incident, of course, shows that Peter still had very little understanding of who Jesus was and what he was actually about. Malchus, though merely doing his duty, was for Peter the embodiment of the enemy, and so he became the target of Peter's sword. Fortunately for Malchus, of course, Peter wasn't a very good swordsman, because I suspect he was aiming for the whole head and not just the ear. But there's something very natural and instinctive about protecting what we love, isn't there? When the object of our love is threatened, we immediately become blinded by rage and fear, and we quickly jump into action to avoid the pain of losing what we hold dear. In such moments, we don't take time to sit and calculate the consequences. It doesn't even matter if the threat is real or perceived. Sometimes our rage is aroused because we have completely misunderstood the situation or the dynamics, and innocent victims are smitten when really they are no potential harm to us. We just think they are. Our country, unfortunately, is in danger of becoming consumed by such irrational fears. We're seeing signs of hate-mongering, violence against other religious groups, against immigrants. We must pray and pray passionately that these things stop, and we must do our part to show the love of God. Be careful that we don't find ourselves doing the same kinds of things that Peter did in our everyday lives. There are times when we hit back in rage and retaliation, or we run away from the pain and we abandon those that we perceive to be a threat to our way of thinking. There are times when we even try to destroy what we know that other person holds dear. We tend to fight back and inflict pain and suffering on those who knowingly or unknowingly touch us where we hurt. Malchus must have assumed some type of an aggressive posture. He must have made either a look or a move towards Jesus, perhaps with the intent of laying his hand on Jesus. Perhaps it was that look, that movement, that touch that brought Peter to the attack. But let's replay the tape for a moment. Before these shocking scenes in Gethsemane, the disciples had shared the Last Supper with Jesus in the upper room. We know that story well, don't we? And when we think about that scene, we don't recall anything about concealed weapons. Our minds are filled with more beautiful, yet equally powerful things. Jesus girds himself with a towel and washes the dirty feet of his disciples, and in essence, challenges us to do the same thing. We hear the echo of his eloquent and profound words. We're still stunned and silenced by their simple yet profound significance. These words and actions have become foundational to our Christian faith, more foundational, I suggest, than any ritual or ceremony built around them. The words themselves are powerful. But even closer to the incident between Peter and Malchus, just a stone's throw away, Jesus had been praying. And he'd been praying in such gut-wrenching agony that drops of blood actually mingled with his perspiration and fell to the ground. Jesus came to the garden for prayer. Peter came for warfare. Listen to Luke 22:38. They said to him, "Lord, look, here are 2 swords." And Jesus replied, "Enough of that. Enough of that." The disciples sharpening their swords to a razor's edge is really not a scene that we normally associate with Easter, is it? Jesus praying in the garden, yes, we get that. The disciples sleeping while he's praying, yes, we get that too. But disciples ready to kill and maim someone? But wait, why shouldn't we have expected this? Luke 22:49 shows us that the disciples expected trouble, and they were prepared for a battle they just couldn't win. Still, it seems so out of sync with who Jesus is. He'd already taught them way back in the Sermon on the Mount that his way is the way of turning the other cheek. So why the swords? How do you reconcile these 2 radically different approaches? It's such a far cry from any approach that the disciples could possibly imagine Jesus taking. And yet, it's the approach they take, the only one they can think of. It seems some people are always ready for a fight. As soon as they saw the light of the torches flickering through the trees, Peter and the other disciples knew exactly what was going on. It's not a stretch of the imagination to see Peter kind of slip his hand into his robe and grasping the handle of his well-concealed sword. Knowing what's about to happen, we might easily be able to justify his actions. We might even call them heroic. Peter is putting his life on the line for his friend, and he's taking a huge and dangerous risk. Isn't that noble? Isn't that heroic? But Peter has not yet learned the way of Jesus. Like so many others, he seems to see life in terms of confrontation and conflict only. So many of us are always ready for a fight, always ready to defend ourselves and to destroy anyone that we perceive as being the enemy. So many people still believe that attacking someone else and causing pain, humiliation, and suffering can somehow be justified. But is that the way of Jesus? If we don't understand that it's not, then we're not much closer to understanding who Jesus is than Peter was. When you have that attitude, people just don't seem to matter. Peter didn't see Malchus as a fellow human being. I remember back in Rwanda, when the Tutsis and the Hutu were at war. In order to justify what they did to their enemies, they had to come up with other names. They had to dehumanize them. So they didn't see a human being when they were slicing them to pieces with their machetes. They saw tall trees that they felt needed to be chopped down. Oh, they saw cockroaches that just needed to be stomped on. They didn't see people. Peter didn't see Malchus that night as a fellow human being. He didn't think about his wife and his children and what would happen to them if he'd taken off Malchus's head and not just his ear. Blinded by his fear and his conviction that this is the right thing to do, Peter was also blind to the big picture and to the implications of his actions. We are so much like Peter. It disturbs me, really, when I read Peter and his story, because I see myself over and over again in Peter. We're so much like him. Our brain tends to freeze up at the first hint of fear or threat. We don't stop to consider the value of the person we're about to strike out against and the pain and suffering that we're about to inflict on them. We don't stop to think about what it will take to close and heal the wound that we are about to open, a wound that may never be healed. It's been said that misery loves company, and that's all we succeed in doing, creating a company of miserable people who have to live with the consequences of our action, one as perpetrator and the other as recipient. Most of our attacks, of course, are not with swords. They're most often with words. Still, they're lethal. We kill relationships, the other person's sense of self-value and self-esteem. We kill any hope of a shared future with them. And so there they are, the walking wounded, bruised and bleeding from the wounds, often inflicted by our words, by our attitudes, by our actions. Some of them have scars they will carry to their graves, deep gashing wounds to their minds, to their feelings, to their attitudes. But that's not what Jesus had in mind on this fateful night in the Garden of Gethsemane. This is not the struggle he envisioned, not the one to which he had already committed and resigned himself after his agonizing prayer. We don't have any difficulty figuring out Malchus. We get Malchus, don't we? Who he was, what he was doing there that night. We get that. We've all been wounded. We get that too. We don't have any difficulty getting Peter either, do we? We've all lashed out at someone else in a moment of pain or fear. What's not so easy to grasp, however, is who Jesus is. What he's up to on this fateful night in the garden. What's he doing? What's he trying to accomplish? No one has more to fear than him tonight. No one has more right to be angry. He's been betrayed, and he's about to be denied by another of his followers. And yet he alone has the ability to stand up to this entire battalion if he chooses to. And yet he refuses to fight back. Doesn't seem to make sense, does it? His followers are defending him. but he's refusing to fight. But that's the way of Jesus. Grace and peace come from him, but it's not always dispensed by those of us who call ourselves his followers. You know, we could change the world if we dealt with pain and suffering his way instead of our way. The story of Peter, Malchus, and Jesus on the road to Calvary is a very brief one, but there are a number of very important lessons that I don't want you to lose. Actually, 7 of them. They jump right out of the Scripture itself, so I'm just going to give you the Scriptures. Luke 22:51, "No more of this," said Jesus. "No more of this." You see, Israel believed in the thing called retribution theology, and it had locked the nation into an endless cycle of retaliation. It was eye for eye, tooth for tooth, till the whole world was left blind and toothless. Someone then and now had to cry out, "No more of this." Instinctively, we're prone to strike back, but Jesus says, turn the other cheek. In other words, take the power out of the violence. Just refuse to engage in it. No more of this. The second verse is Matthew 26:52. Put the sword back into its place. All those who use the sword will die by the sword. In other words, lay down your weapons. Was Jesus afraid that Peter was going to improve his aim and take off Malchus's head or mutilate someone else? Did you notice that Jesus didn't command both of them to put down their swords? Just Peter. We all know people who are always ready to go on the offensive, always ready for a fight. So what do we do when we run into such people? Jesus says, it's simple. You lay down your weapons. Don't go on the attack. Sounds like weakness, does it? But it's actually the most powerful thing you can do. It's the most courageous, the strongest thing you could possibly do. Your enemy is not going to put down his weapon. It is you and I who have to make ourselves vulnerable and follow the way of Jesus. It's the way of loving our enemies. Third principle comes from the verse that says, do you not think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? In other words, don't fight back, even if you have the power to do so. Jesus had resources at his disposal that could have annihilated the entire group of soldiers that came to arrest him. But he knew that that was not the way. Stooping to someone else's level and responding as they had responded didn't have much of a good history of success. He'd come to introduce another way, a better way, and it didn't involve fighting back, returning evil for evil. It was about turning the other cheek. Fourthly, Matthew chapter 26, verse 54. But how then would the Scriptures be fulfilled that say that this must happen in this way? Jesus is saying there's a better way. There's a better way. Peter had a habit of seeing things only one way, his way. Someone said, you'll know Peter when you get to heaven. He'll be the one with a mouth shaped like a foot, because he so often kept putting his foot in his mouth. He could see no way of escape but the sword. I'm not even sure he thought about how that was going to work out. Jesus saw this as a part of God's master plan, something to which he had already committed himself, something to which he had already submitted himself, confident that the Father was going to sustain him throughout the whole thing. Here's the fifth principle, Luke chapter 21, verse 51. And he touched the man's ear and healed him. Now, this is perhaps a little more difficult to figure out, so stay with me. Even our enemies have enemies. And more often than not, they are their own worst enemies, and they are haunted by their own secret fears and dreams. So don't let that healing, that miracle, escape you, will you? Jesus is being betrayed by one of his own disciples. But while Peter, who would soon deny him that he ever knew him, while he's carelessly swinging a sword and slicing off the ear of the high priest's servant, Malchus, Jesus is doing nothing to escape the torture and the death that he knows is awaiting him. The soldiers will arrest him. They and others will eventually torture and crucify him. Yet Jesus knows that Malchus and his fellow soldiers are the victims of a tyrannical Roman government. He sees their secret pain and the wounds that they so carefully hide as they carry out their orders. Whether I like it or not, I'm doing my duty. Sometimes that creates deep wounds in itself. Again, Jesus sees what Peter doesn't, and he doesn't want to victimize Malchus or the soldiers any further. The sixth principle: the victims are really more powerful than their oppressors. Now that makes sense only when you've heard the many other upside-down statements that Jesus has made. Blessed are the peacemakers. The meek shall inherit the earth. Blessed are they who are persecuted. Why? Because loving and forgiving your enemies not only sets them free, it also sets you free. And that's more power than your enemies possess. Because you have the ability to forgive. You have the power to set yourself free and to set your enemy free. And that's a power your enemy doesn't have. You can set your enemy free from debt, and you can set yourself free from the burden of having to collect that debt. And that sets both of you free. It sets you free from the past, and it sets you free to embrace God's plan for your present and for your future. Refusing to forgive keeps you in the prison, keeps your enemy in the prison. And you alone possess the power to change all those dynamics. But this is really not possible by human means only, is it? Only Jesus could pick up Malchus's ear and put it back in its place and have it perfectly healed. And only Jesus can give us the power to love and forgive, even when we think it's impossible to do so. Final principle, John 18:11. Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? The principle is that there is victory in full surrender. Jesus is not a victim in the garden. Brothers and sisters, as you watch him all the way to the cross, as you watch him on the cross, please understand, Jesus is not a victim. He already has won the victory when he surrendered to his Father's will amongst those same olive trees. If he had used the power at his disposal, if he'd called down legions of angels, the battle would have been won in seconds, but the war would have been lost. Jesus would not have been true to his Father. He would have failed in his mission, even though he had won the battle. Winning the battle and losing the war was simply not an option to him. It looked like surrender to Peter, but Jesus knew that this was the pathway to victory. The cross so often looks like a place of surrender and defeat, doesn't it? Only those who see the world through the eyes of Jesus can see the victory that the cross represents. Only they can see Jesus not as a victim, but somebody fully committed to you and to me and to the Father's way of redeeming us from our sin. He's no victim. He's a victor. Jesus knew that this was the only way. This was the only way. And it was the right way, because it's the way that God had chosen. And so Malchus is healed. Peter is forgiven and restored. And we too can be healed of the wounds that others have inflicted upon us. And we too can be forgiven for the wounds that we have often inflicted on others, because we do it in the name and in the power of this wonderful wounded healer who reached out and restored Malchus's ear, and who can reach out and restore us. Whatever the cause of our pain, whatever the pain we have inflicted, the wounded healer has the power to heal. Will you join me in a moment of prayer? Father, we thank you for your word. There is so much in your word. All we need is the eyes to look, and all we need is the open mind to receive that word and make application to our own circumstances, to our own pain, to the people that we've inflicted pain upon. And healing can come to us just as surely as it came to Malchus. But so often, like Malchus, we claim the healing and then we just go and do what we were always going to do. Forgive us, Father, and help us to treat others in the way that you have treated us, to see them through your eyes. I pray in the name of Jesus.